Okay, awesome. Thank you everyone for joining. For those who attended last week, we had a good number, and that one was a power hour. So we engaged in a lot of action together, and we've provided a document of the actions that were discussed in the meeting. So if you want to visit colonial.com/action, I'll just put it in the chat. You can access the document, and if you have other actions throughout the week that you want to share, we can update it on the website. But I wanted to welcome our guest speaker today. We have a really wonderful topic and presentation from Emma Caroe. I don't know if I pronounced your last name right. But Emma is a community worker, activist, and queer person of faith from the UK. They work in community development at a city-centered church, creating spaces of welcome, care, and connection with groups experiencing various forms of marginalization and hardship. Emma studied sociology and politics at the University of Cambridge, and their participation in social movements and political activism began with organizing school strikes in Sheffield as a teenager, and they now love living in Cambridge. They were recently on a Sibiu Kairos UK delegation, and this was a delegation of creatives, journalists, activists from both the UK and Ireland and other parts also in Latin America. And they recently went to Palestine earlier in September. We had the privilege of hosting them and taking them around, and they were a wonderful group. And Emma, they'll like talk to us about their time in Palestine, as well as kind of the connections that they made to the UK. So Emma, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time today to speak to us, and we're really excited to hear from you. So maybe you can give your presentation, and then after you're done, we'll have maybe 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, and then anytime we have left, we can engage in action together.
Great, that sounds good. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. Special thanks to Sabine. It was such an amazing privilege to be able to spend some time in Palestine earlier this month, and I'm excited to share some stories and to give voice to the people that I met there with you all today. So if you'll bear with me a moment, I'm going to figure out how I share my screen for you all. And I've not done this before. So I'm hoping I may not be able to see my notes while I screen share, so forgive me, but let's give it a go. I hope that all works for you. Can you all see the presentation? Oh, no. Right. So my topic today is violence in Palestine, and particularly looking at the colonial nature of that violence. I was really struck by the way in which violence was infused throughout the society that I saw my time in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And I want to unpick the nature of that violence and to tell some specific stories about how individuals in Palestine experience violence in a multitude of forms throughout their daily lives. And I'm going to draw some parallels as well, some parallels and also some direct causality and links between the violence that we see in Israel, from settlers and from the state, to my country's own imperial past, to Britain's legacy, and to some continuities of how that coloniality continues today and how those logics continue to contribute to the oppression that we see around the world, including in Palestine at this moment in time. As I said, I found that the violence was something really striking in my first impressions of Palestine. This was the first time that I'd visited. I have read about it so much, but it's so different to become immersed and to be there. And from all aspects of life. Here we have pictured the grave here, just one example of how Israel attacks and murders many, many people who don't all get the same attention as journalists and other well-known figures, to the violence threatens and these signs in the center picture here, to the violence of this wall of segregation within the neighborhood, between neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. And so violence is my theme today, and I feel that the experience of that violence really weighs heavy on the shoulders of all who live there and all those who get to visit and to carry that experience home with them. That has certainly been my experience in these last 2 weeks since returning home. So I want to go back to about a century and look at how Israel began with violence, but by violent dispossession and displacement. And I want to talk particularly about this village of Lifta, which was one that we visited on one of our first days in Jerusalem. And here you can see pictured one of the buildings of Lifta. So Lifta village was home to about 3,000 Palestinians in the early 20th century, and it was entirely violently depopulated in the Nakba in 1948. Its inhabitants have obviously had no rights to return, and this village lies in ruins around, surrounded by settlements that have grown up, now part of Israel, of West Jerusalem. And this was a place of deep history where violence, I felt, was embedded within the stones themselves. Those stones carry the living memory of that loss, of the force and the brutality that the inhabitants suffered when they were displaced at gunpoint out of their homes. Something really striking to me was the way in which holes had been struck through the roofs and the floors of all of these homes. So not just the violence towards people that has been passed down through living memory and that is still borne by people, but these buildings still bear the marks of that violence. And this to me really spoke of a deliberate cruelty, because this is not a senseless act of violence here. This is a deliberate attempt to undermine the structural integrity of these hand-built buildings by knocking through the cornerstone that kept these buildings up. And so they're very fragile. That's a clear project of demolition and intentional violence there meant to make displacement permanent. And that really struck me. I found a really difficult thing to view, looking into that hole and those holes in the ceilings as well. I wonder how those holes, how that physical remains of violence speaks to you. And secondly, I was really struck by the way in which barbed wire was strewn around these buildings. So the inhabitants of Lifta were cleared out at gunpoint by paramilitary forces, unable to return. They have been displaced throughout what is now Israel, and is also East Jerusalem and the West Bank, meaning that they are fragmented, holding different forms of ID and legal identity that splits them apart as to what would have been this really close-knit pairing community is now fragmented and dispersed. So they're already experienced huge amounts of violence and displacement here. They already are unable to return because of the threat of physical violence. Why add the barbed wire? What does it do? What does it do to this space? Where, how does that add to this sensation of fear, of danger? And how does it, to me, convey I wonder, it sort of conveys a message here about what this space is. And to me, I found like it was an Israeli attempt to twist the narrative to associate this space, which is saturated by Palestinian history and saturated by the evidence of Israeli violence, and to sort of turn it into this unsafe place so that Palestinian history is associated with danger. Um, it's not a pleasant place to return to. And it really, to me, it was like it added that extra edge to a violence that had been committed, uh, less than 100 years ago, but several generations ago. Um, Here was this barbed wire confronting us in the present day with sharpness, with danger, and with a fear of violence. Lister is just one example, and as I'm sure many of you are so aware, the numbers displaced in the Nakba were in the hundreds of thousands, and Lister is just one glimpse of the countrywide violence inflicted by paramilitary forces in that catastrophic year. But it didn't begin there even. And Britain has a lot to do with the history of violence that preceded this moment in time. And you are probably all familiar with the infamous Balfour Declaration. And this is just emblematic to me of the way in which Britain wielded its colonial power as still an imperial state, to ascribe rights and to protect certain groups against others and to wield violence towards them. Balfour is a figure particularly central in my imaginary is because I studied at Cambridge. I studied at a college just neighbouring from Trinity College, where Balfour was educated. Balfour is part of the legacy of the institution that I studied at, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who studied in these elite British institutions were shaped in ways which to go and have a view towards the world and a mindset which legitimated in their eyes this this colonial mindset of this giving away of one people's home to another. I've seen how Cambridge University dominates the local area, let alone of the Cambridge town, let alone on a global scale. And so I think I always want to bring up Balfour as an example of the ways in which our institutions have a real enduring legacy in the ways in which they shape the people who go out to commit violence and cause harm on the global scale. And it wasn't just an individual, it was the British state and the British army as a whole. And I found this photo online, sourced from the Holton archive, which shows the ways in which violence towards entire communities and displacement and armed force was not a first in the Nakba of 1948. This is in 1938, 10 years earlier, in response to the what's known as the Arab Revolt, beginning in 1936. At this point, Britain was still in nominal control of the territories, but as Zionist settlement gathered pace and the economy, the Jewish economy began to accelerate, Palestinians began to resist this takeover of their land, starting with a general strike in 1936 and escalating into widespread national revolt. And this was brutally, brutally repressed by British forces themselves. In fact, over 100,000 British troops were deployed in Palestine to suppress this uprising, which then left 10% of adult male Arab of the Arab male population either killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. So we as Britain have been complicit from the very beginning here. And when we think about violence, when we think about who is waging violence, we cannot forget that Britain as a country was part and parcel of this project from the very beginning, and in fact modeled these modes of violent repression that were then replicated by Zionist paramilitary and then by the State of Israel in later years. So, from widespread dispossession and communities to in the past to the here and now. Many of you may have seen this artwork. It's beautiful, but it's in honor of Alda Hasselin, who tragically and unbelievably was shot just over a month ago in his village of Al-Khir, and by the infamous settler Yinon Levy. And Alda is just one individual example, again, of how now in the present day, this violence is waged towards communities. So some of you may really have heard this story, but I'm going to tell it one more time. Al-Khir is in an area of the South Hebron Hills, which is Masafayata, which has been under a particularly savage attack in recent years. And there's a settlement just near Auda's village from which one day in July, a group of people came with a bulldozer. They began conducting earthworks, they began rooting up the ground, and on their way home, they decided to plough through the olive groves of this local community. And so some young men attempted to stop that, and there became an altercation. Now, Alda was at a distance, filming, peacefully observing, and he was then shot by Yinon Levy, who was chaotically wielding his gun, threatening those involved. He was shot in the chest. And he died later that day. We had the privilege of meeting Basil, Basil, a friend of his and the director of No Other Lands, the documentary that Alda featured in. And he told us how much this death has bereaved the whole community, as he was such a pillar of those people, of that group. And the thing is, it doesn't stop there. We heard that since Alda's death, since his murder, brutal attacks have continued, from raids on people's homes to the rounding up of people in the days following his death, their detention. On the left, you can see here this old man. He's 86, and he and his wife were raided in their home by armed settlers, beaten with sticks, and left. Yeah, it's a really disturbing video, which you can find on Basil's Instagram, and may wish to watch. But it was just heartbreaking to hear Basil tell us of all of these crimes, which, although Alda's story made the news and it sort of gave headlines and we all heard about it and there was a wave of vigils and protests, it's continued since. And in fact, just 4 days after we had met with Basil, we saw him update the world that his brother had been physically attacked, and he had ended up being hospitalized, and that's the video that you can see on the right here. But as we know, yes, we name people who commit these horrendous acts, such as Yinon Levy, but this violence is not just an individual settler issue. This violence is state violence, and that's something has been made clear by international experts around the world, including B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. And in fact, they say that settler violence is a form of government policy aided and abetted by official state authorities with their active participation. And B'Tselem says that that takes two forms. One, the legitimation of violent land takeover, and whether that's through declaring certain areas states' land and making a distinction between that and which is owned privately by Palestinians, a distinction which is relatively arbitrary and has no basis in international law, or other means such as weaponizing a old Ottoman Empire rule, which states that if private land is not used for farming or otherwise, otherwise used for 3 years, it can be reclaimed by the state. And so there's this deliberate policy and legal mechanisms by which the state legitimizes land takeover. And secondly, it legitimizes the violence committed by individuals. And in Auda's case is a particular example of how this works. Despite Yinon Levy being this infamous criminal, he's been sanctioned, including by the UK government. He was not held accountable for the murder that he committed, and in fact, a few days after, was released simply on house arrest. And this is a pattern that happens time and time again of how the settlers who commit these atrocities are not held accountable before the courts, are let off and are allowed to continue that pattern of violence week after week, year after year. In fact, often supported and protected by the Israeli police and by the army. So, for example, when the army came in response to Auda's killing, they didn't arrest Levy. They instead turned on Auda's relatives and friends who had been involved in this altercation with the settlers and arrested them. And they, in fact, enforcement returned in the days following Auda's death, instructing grieving rights to arrest more of his relatives and friends. And so we see that many layers, both at the individual settler level, often ideologically motivated or religiously motivated to commit violence and to seize land. We have deeper layers of state violence, legitimizing, enabling, abetting this takeover. And that's because this is a deeply colonial venture. This takeover of land is something that is deeply ingrained in the Zionist settler colonial project. And it is a huge failure to uphold international law by the UK to not be recognizing it as such. And as you can see from this press release, as just one example pictured here, we see time and time again that the UK makes bold moves, or moves that it portrays as bold, to sanction settlers who commit these atrocities, but it's at the individual level. It's a handful of individual settlers, a few organizations, and in the language in which this is framed, they are understood as extremists. And this language of extremism of individuals totally fails to acknowledge the way this violence is ingrained systemically at the state level of Israeli society. That amounts, I would argue, to a complicity in it, especially given our history of state violence ourselves, as we talked about earlier. And finally, a slightly different form of violence, the violent erasure of identity. I want to talk about some of the beautiful examples of Palestinian culture that we had the privilege of seeing, and how they are both violently erased and how that erasure itself is violent. So 3 examples here. We met Hannah Tams, a dancer and choreographer who performed for us this amazing contemporary dabka. It was full of energy, full of power, full of a vibrancy of spirit, which is being repressed. Hannah has been arrested for his work, threatened with indefinite detention if he doesn't stop performing and doing his artistic work. He was only able to get out of that lockhold because of his international recognition, having won American awards and the like. When Hannah goes into schools, there's a lot of fear around whether he can teach the dabka that he's so amazing at. That's part of the that's quintessentially part of the Palestinian tradition and culture. Partly simply because many of those songs that dabka is danced to mention Palestine. He's not allowed to mention Palestine when he teaches about Palestinian folklore, history, and dance. Similarly, the attempt to erase Palestinian identity was there in the 20th century when women were making and wearing on the everyday these beautiful clothes. You can see the chess piece here. That's the sort of central part of it. And this was, in fact, a Christian Palestinian woman. And we know that because these 4 circles represent the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. And Hannah told us how, because the Palestinian flag was banned, women would deliberately weave those colours into their garments so that they could be wearing these symbols of their identity, despite the massive repression that they were under. I spoke about how this woman was Christian, and just one example of the way identity is repressed is through religious practices and the control of religious practice. So, for example, if a neighborhood is declared a Jewish neighborhood, that outlaws any non-Jewish religious practices, such that there are even laws banning Christmas trees and fairy lights, Christmas lights, even deeply, deeply ironically in the city of Nazareth itself. And finally, we have Ahmed, who's one of the managers of the educational bookshop in Jerusalem. And like Hannah, he's faced violent repression and, in fact, arrests for the work that he does to showcase Palestinian culture and identity. You may well have seen the headlines back in February when his bookshop was raided. Books seized. Ahmed and Mahmoud, his uncle, were both detained for 48 hours in hugely inhumane, cold and cramped conditions. And that court case is still open against them. So that threat is weighing on them each day that they are open. Again, the soldiers were going through this bookshop, not even speaking English or Arabic, which all of these books are in. And so using Google Translate to try and figure out which of these books could arguably be named incitement against the Israeli state. And what they ended up doing is simply seizing anything that explicitly mentioned something like Palestine. And so that's clearly a deliberate assault and repression of very Palestinian, their very identity of Palestinians. And why do they do this? Well, colonial projects throughout history, especially British ones, have aimed to repress identity. And colonialism is not just political and economic, but it comes in cultural forms as well. This being a quintessential example of how indigenous peoples were forced to adopt the cultures of the colonizing power. This was something the British carried out throughout India and the Americas and in Africa as well. Why? Partly because identity is what keeps people alive, keeps people human, and sustains their resistance. If that spirit of independent identity can be broken, they can be assimilated into the colonizing culture and can be far more easily controlled. By undermining these cultures and these practices which hold people together as communities, the colonizing power can wage a strategy of divide and conquer, fragmenting groups within the colonized people. And we see that at play in the way the Israeli state operates now. Hannah told us that some of the children that he works with in what is now Israel, who are Palestinians holding Israeli residency, they are not taught a Palestinian curriculum. They are subject to an Israeli one, which does not tell them the history of what their people experienced in junctures such as 1948 and 1967. In fact, they don't not even made aware of what their Palestinian siblings are going through in the Palestinian territories. Then these children might not even know what a checkpoint is, for example, and that fragments Palestinian communities, such as those inside and outside of Israel. The connection between them is broken through the erasure of their cultural memory, their history, and their identity. And I think, however, that it goes deeper than this in the case of Israel and Palestinians. There's not just, like we see in this picture here, an attempt to assimilate, to turn the colonized into quote unquote civilized beings who adopt the colonizer's culture. In the eyes of Israel, non-Jewish Palestinians can never be full Israelis, and instead, the attempt to erase identity is about erasing existence itself, and that's what's so terrifying about it. I think this rests on what you see at the top of the page here, a coloniality of being. That's a fundamental hierarchy in a colonial logic of one people's humanity being deemed less than another's. That's what we understand. That's what the term, as developed by decolonial sociologists, means. And that's the being of one people is seen as inferior, less than human, non-human. We see that in Israeli rhetoric. And so this legitimizes the degradation, the erasure of those people's identity and culture. And what does this have to do with Britain today? You might recognize these photos. This is from the weekend of protests that we had here in the UK just 10 days ago. These protests were about give us our country back. Back from whom, obviously, it begs the question. And implicit here is back from people of the global majority, people of different cultures and religions and faith practices, people who don't look like British people, people who don't look like us. And what that fundamentally hinges on is this same coloniality of being, where some lives are deemed less valuable, less important, and less contributing, less human than others. These things are linked. I'm not suggesting that we should downplay the experience of Palestinians by making an equation between these things, but what I would like to suggest is that these systems of dehumanization of marginalized groups, of particularly along racialized lines of people of color, of Western and non-Western peoples, of those with power and those without. These are systems of violence that manifest themselves in physical violence as well as cultural, ideological, and other forms of violence. These things are interlinked, or these injustices around the world are connected. And I was reflecting on my time in Palestine as after I came home, and I came back into my work in my local community, which in some ways feels miles away. In some ways, it's this huge culture shock to have immersed myself in the Palestinian world, in this huge, grave global injustice, and then to come back and to sit with people who are struggling with their benefits, struggling with homelessness, struggling with mental health challenges in my local community. But in some ways, these things are linked. These people's lives are treated as less valuable. And these people, as a result, in the words of Hannah, he said, Jerusalemites, for as an example, they're not living, they are working to pay their taxes. They're working like animals. And that's a brutal statement by Hannah there. But to make that comparison, but what he's speaking of is the ways in which the threat of violence, the violence and the repression and oppression that Palestinians experience, that violence is dehumanizing. And I think that's something that people in our own societies experience too. The person that I had dinner with last night at one of our community meals, he's on the streets at the moment. He's been in and out of prison. He struggles with addiction. He's dismissed, treated as inferior, less worthy, invisible by a lot of society. And he, from what he was saying to me, he's not living a life either. And so I think this speaks to that phrase that's well known paraphrase of Nelson Mandela's uh, speech that none of us are free until Palestine is free, in that all of these injustices around the world are interlinked and hinge on this colonial devaluation of some humans versus others. And Palestine is what happens when we take these things that we see in our own societies to an extreme, to a whole people, when this dehumanization is applied to a whole people in pursuit of a colonial project. And so, as British citizens, we need to wake up and we need to be hyper aware of what is going on. Mustafa Barghouti told us when we saw him on our visit, what we are seeing here is not just occupation. It is not just an apartheid worse than in South Africa. We are facing a settler colonial project that wants to eradicate the Palestinian population. That's some heavy words. But I think we need to be highly awake to this reality. And I think we need to understand the colonial logics of violence and dehumanization that legitimize and drive this attempt to eradicate. And as British citizens, as I've unpicked through our history and through our current complicity in failing to respond in a way that acknowledges the state's violence as well as individual, we have a responsibility there to make good our colonial legacy on the world. But we also have a responsibility as fellow humans to recognize the fundamental humanity of each and every one of our neighbors, whether that's the person on the streets of our city here in our neighborhoods, or it's the Palestinian people themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really powerful presentation and very insightful presentation. I really enjoyed how you kind of connected it also to kind of the more recent events in the UK, but of course, like there's fascism popping up everywhere around the world, and I think a lot of people get really surprised when there's like, oh, like I can't believe my country's getting fascist when, like you kind of connected everything that we do, that the West does in the global South will eventually come back to haunt them, and I think we see this in the case of Palestine. Before Palestine, it was Algeria or Vietnam. So thank you so much for kind of allowing us to kind of think through these themes and issues. I wanted to open it up now for questions. If you have questions for Emma, whether it be more about the trip or thinking through some of the themes that Emma wonderfully kind of brought into the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat and I'll make sure to relay it to them. Okay, I see one question first, so I'll ask this question, and then if there's any other questions, we can add to it. So Carol said, so you touched on this. I'm wondering if you can expand. My understanding is that the colonization of Palestine was modeled after the British conquest of America, among other things. Does this match your findings? If so, what traits do you see that match the conquest of America, and what doesn't match? And I want to add here too, I know this question didn't mention the United States in particular, but I think bringing in the case of Ireland would be also be a really good example since that's really also intimately linked, I think. So yeah, if you could expand maybe a little bit on that.
Absolutely. Yes. There's a huge amount of continuity and parallel between the colonial projects that Britain carried out in both the US and Ireland. Um, I'll pick out just a couple of examples of traits that I can see that we see in both. Um, Firstly and most deeply, there's the fact that, again, this coloniality of being was weaponized. So the peoples of these nations who were colonized, the indigenous peoples of America and the Irish, were constructed as inferior beings. And actually, the way in which this was done was religious initially. This isn't a new thing that religion is weaponized in pursuit of political goals. And so, actually, as the conquest of the Americas began in the 1500s, before a concept of race and racialization was developed, the original um, dividing line by which people were designated as fully human or less than human was by religion, and it was by Christianity, because it was linked to concept of the soul. And so we see there this idea of some people dehumanized and violence therefore legitimated against them, and we see religion being utilized there. In terms of more practically the sort of mechanisms of violence, um, house demolition as a means of repression of a people. And I want to do more research into this because I don't know loads about it, but this was something the British used in Ireland. So actually, it was so close to home. Um, it's easy to forget that history. Um, but this is something that's, yeah, been a way of repressing peoples that's been used by British colonial projects many times. And again, touched on in the presentation with that image. But the repression of culture of indigenous peoples was a huge thing in the Americas, the First Nation peoples. Particularly, one example is the ways in which indigenous children were taken away from their families and placed into schools that would educate them in the colonial culture. And in fact, that's a really powerful example of how genocide of a population does not actually have to necessarily mean killing and violence in a physical way. Um, Arguably, what we saw in Canada, in the modern US, was a cultural genocide in which a deliberate project of erasure of Indigenous culture was carried out through things like schooling.
Thanks, Emma. I see another question about specific about the delegation. So maybe you can talk about like your visit with Mustafa Berghouti, how that was, how you managed to visit him. So yeah.
Um, I am not sure how we exactly how we ended up being able to have that meeting. It certainly was a huge privilege. We met in Ramallah, um, and the name escapes me, but it was in a medical organization that does a huge amount of humanitarian work. Um, he spoke really powerfully. It was an amazing to gain his insight over decades of Palestinian political history. He had some scathing things to say about the Oslo Accords, recognizing the ways in which the delegation was trapped and how agreements were made behind their backs. And he also offered a really compelling vision for the sort of levers of change of how the global balance of power depends both on the organization of Palestinian civil society um, and also on turning the tables of the global balance of power. And he said categorically that he did think something had shifted on the global scale in these last 2 years as we have mobilized around the world, that something has changed, and that Palestinians can feel it, that this really is a critical juncture.
Thanks so much, Emma. Trying to see if there's other questions here. But maybe I can ask, maybe just because you mentioned, or in your bio at the beginning, that you engage in a lot of faith-based work, community work. So I'm curious kind of how your time in Palestine has influenced you upon your return home, how you're thinking about engaging with community work, if you're engaging it in a different way, how it's been informing kind of your faith-based practices, your relationship with your church, for example. So yeah, I'm just curious in terms of your personal reflections and personal transformations.
Yeah, it certainly was a transforming experience. Um, in terms of community work, I think I came away with a real renewed recognition of how important the building of relationships are um, to building communities of people that can see one another as fully human, can relate to one another, can understand one another's struggles, is an absolutely critical thing to do, um, to prevent um, the violence and dehumanization that we see, to prevent and to heal that. I think it's given me a renewed sort of focus and vocation for the healing of relationship between peoples. Um, but I'm also acutely aware of how that reconciliation, that healing, is something difficult, if not impossible, to speak of in a time of genocide. How justice is absolutely vital towards achieving any sort of meaningful idea of peace. Um, and I'm therefore wrestling, I think, with what it means to be a member of the church, to practice as a Christian within a legacy of Christian imperialism, um, especially when many parts of the church today continue to endorse and sort of spiritually, materially, ideologically uphold these violent colonial understandings, logics, and projects of violence. And I think it's a really difficult thing. I think we have to talk openly about it. I think, and I do see it in my own church, there's a sort of fear of we can't let Palestine dominate everything. You know, you can't bring Palestine into everything because, you know, there's other parts to Christian life, and it wedges things in between people. And but it's becoming increasingly clear to me how essential, how fundamental this question is to our faith, particularly as we have so much to learn from Palestinian liberation theologians, and the wisdom that they can bring us of a Christianity that is not in you know in the throes of imperialist and colonial logics.
Thanks so much, Emma. I don't see any other questions. I don't know if there's any last minute questions people have. They can put it in the chat. We do have 10 minutes left, so I'm happy to engage in some advocacy if we don't have any questions. Okay, nothing is entering the comment section. But I think kind of actually, Emma, you kind of gave us a good transition here because I actually did want to mention some of the Sabio Kairos UK actions. I know Claire, who's part of Sabio Kairos UK, is here in the room right now. And in terms of like Palestinian liberation theology, Sabio Kairos UK is hosting a conference upcoming, kind of focused on from lament to liberation. So I wonder actually, Claire, if you want to share that, and then we can put it in the chat related to just liberation theology that, Emma mentioned.
Are you asking me to comment? Hi, sorry. Were you asking me to comment or just to put in the chat about?
Yeah, you can comment on the conference and what it's about.
So the Kairos uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Conference is taking place in November. I'll need to look up online the exact dates. But the great thing is that there will be many speakers there, but also there's going to be a couple of days which are also solidarity visits to different places in Palestine, which Sabine will be running as well. So it's going to be well worth joining. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head. I'm so sorry, but I will look those up now and I will put them in the chat, and the link to the registration form if anyone is interested. And well done, Emma. That was amazing. I learnt loads. Thank you so much. It was a joy to have you on the trip.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. And I'm sure if some people might want to reach out to you for questions, would you be okay with having your contact information, or they can contact me to ask, so whichever you prefer. And we can put it in the chat for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I can send my email address in the chat if that would be something people would like.
Yeah, that would be awesome. All right, thank you so much. So Emma put their contact information. So if you have any further questions about the presentation, you can just contact them directly there. So again, thank you so much, Emma. Feel free to stay on for the next few minutes. We'll just open it up now for actions that are happening, and just like a group discussion if people want to do that. I see Mary Ann wants to just comment on something about British and Ireland. So, Mary Ann, I don't know if you're.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Tan. And Emma, that was phenomenal. I look forward to watching this recording in 2 weeks, I guess. Is that correct, Tan? When the Kumi Now is on YouTube?
Yeah, we'll usually ask permission from this. So me and Emma will talk and see if we want to put it publicly. If not, it might be a private link. So you can see that on our newsletter. It can be a private link. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, because oh my God, you formulated the whole thing so powerfully. So I just wanted to mention my family comes from both mom and dad's side of the family comes from the west coast of Ireland, and I've only recently learned some of our history from. There's a politician named Richard Lloyd Barrett, who was with the People Before Profit Party in Ireland. And he's been on the stump giving incredible history lessons. So he said that up in, we call it the north of Ireland. We don't say Northern Ireland because that gives the British more control. The language is important. So we call it the north of Ireland because it still is a part of Ireland. But they very specifically, what's the word? Fine-tuned their tactics of torture. The Black and Tans specifically was the name of the special forces that was used to colonize us, and especially in Ulster, which is the province that is still under British rule. So apparently when the Brits went into Palestine, they took the Black and Tans with them. And they were the first ones on the ground enforcing the British colonization of Palestine. And the first British mayor of Jerusalem was quoted as saying, "We are here to create a little loyal Jewish Ulster in the Sea of Arabism." And I just thought that was it was mind-blowing to me. I mean, but of course, I mean, the whole logic of any colonizing project in the end and leads to genocide. It's something that I heard again in this wonderful talk that I heard last Monday. We had one of the refuseniks. What is her name? Atalia Ben, and I forgot the second part of her last name, but She was accompanied by a Jewish educator from Brooklyn named T. Wise, and he quoted some of the early rabbis before the state of Israel was established as saying just that this is the trajectory of what's going to happen. Anyway, genocide on the end, always. Thank you, Emma, and everybody. Thank you, Tan.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Okay, we got also the links. Okay, great, for the conference. So thank you, Claire, for sending that, and thank you again, Marianne, for kind of making some more of those connections. I also see a comment in the chat about the Black and Tans, which were a British group, soldier group that was used, to oppress the Irish, and they were sent during the Arab Revolt in 1939. After oppressing the Irish, and that was a British group that kind of went to Palestine to do that. So there's a direct also connection there. Okay, I'm seeing, I don't know if I see other actions or suggestions of actions in the group. So if anyone has actions they want to share, any updates of actions they want to also share, like feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. Like I said at the beginning, we did have a power hour last week to take some actions. And if you go to, again, the kumina.com/action website, there is a document. You can click on the link and it will give you like a shareable document of some of the actions. In terms of some of the updates on those actions, we had last week a action for Mustafa Yatta because their electricity and water was cut off last week by the by settlers actually, who were trying to build and expand the settlement. But the good news is there were some activists who were able to bring in some water and restore a little bit of electricity, so they at least have some community support there and some international support. If you want more actions also to take for Gaza, I have some few initiatives. There's an ongoing project, you might have already heard of it, but the eSIMs for Gaza. So people are still asking for eSIMs, which are used to connect people in Gaza to the outside world due to internet and electricity outages. And this is also getting worse because of the current displacement that's happening. So if you want to donate for this, I can just send the link in the chat so that you can just either donate or buy an eSIM for them. So I'm just gonna put this in the chat here. Awesome. And yeah, Mary Ann, thank you for also sending some demos that are happening. Kathy also just sent a link if you're based in the US and European governments also about the Global Samud Flotilla. The update with the Global Samud Flotilla is Israel today tweeted or released a public statement that basically said the Global Samud Flotilla is being organized by Hamas. And so now this gives them kind of diplomatic, or not diplomatic, but cover to essentially possibly bomb the flotilla as it approaches Gaza. So, there's a lot of fear for the lives of the activists and civilians who are on board these ships. So they have asked the international community to reach out to their governments, to their leaders, to demand safe passage for the Global Samud Flotilla. And so you can click on that link. You can also just go on their social media to see how you can get involved and track their movement. This is important because I think in the coming days, they should theoretically reach Gaza. So that's one big action that I think people should pay attention to and just look out for. So that's one thing that I would really just encourage everyone to do this week. The other update here in Palestine, I want to say before we finish the session, many of you know also Layan Nasser, who is an Anglican Christian. She's like 23, 24 years old from Birzeit, and she was administratively detained last year for, I think, 8 months. And then she was released after a hostage exchange. And she was last week or 2 weeks ago, she had to go to a court hearing around the same time that Shadi Khoury also went to a hearing. And they recently, today, told Layan's family that they will imprison her and giving her a sentence of, I think, 7 months. And we don't know when she will be arrested. They might come in the middle of the night. And so this is an ongoing situation that we don't know if she's going to be detained today, tomorrow. So just keep her, if you're a person of faith, keep her in your prayers. Try to advocate with your churches and your governments just to let them know that Layan Nasser is being detained again and taken back to prison, which during this time it's even worse now with the conditions in the prisons. So just to keep her in your thoughts. So with that, sorry, it's a very depressing note to end, but I hope that some of these actions at least you can do this week. But yeah, I hope that everyone is able to do that. I hope everyone found this presentation helpful. Thank you again, Emma. Thank you again, Claire, for all the work that you've done in this presentation. So, and thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to email me if you need anything, and I hope to see everyone next week for another Colonial session.
Thank you so much for having me.